Okay, so welcome back for everyone watching. Now, today, of course, we have a very special guest,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Josh and I go back, what, a couple years now?
Yeah, three
Um,
years, something
three
like that.
years. Unfortunately, it was through certain social media platforms that will not be
Yeah.
named because it's a
Mm-hmm.
little embarrassing.
Yep.
Um, but uh, I think that at that point, we were both in a time in our lives where we weren't so much, confessionally reformed. We were still
Mm,
amongst the modern Calvinist circles. So it's not until later that we really, got into the history of Reformed Orthodoxy and got into our actual tradition, being that modernists nowadays will pervert it. So we are in a much better place in our life, thankfully. But
yeah.
yeah, when we met, we were not we were not that good.
No. Yeah, it was I think like our daily diet of like reformed intake was like guys like James White,
Yep.
Jeff Durbin.
And
Um
at best, Voss, which isn't terrible,
mhm.
but still, that was like at best. Like
Yeah.
your hardest Voss.
Yeah, best Bovink and Voss.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it was just I mean and a lot of people were like that. And I think um the work that Richard Muller is doing, David Sitzma, Jordan Baller, in the area of Reformed Orthodox retrieval is definitely. I can remember just the first stepping stones of like actually having a taxonomy to parse out the tradition. It was like eye opening, and yeah, it's like, and then getting exposed to sources such as PRDL. Um, it was yeah, it was just great. And now that I can say that I have a firm grasp on where the Reformed tradition comes from, who are our representative theologians. um, we were just those hardcore Calvinists,
Oh
but
yeah.
it was an interesting MacArthurites. uh, yeah, interesting time.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the figures that we would definitely would not have been aware of back
Hmm.
then is Franciscus Junius, right?
Yes.
And so, before we actually get into Junius, could you give us some or a brief introduction? Who are you for those who
Yeah.
don't know? What do you do? What are your interests?
Hmm.
Especially, I'm curious about your, at least I believe, relatively recent interest in law.
Hmm.
Uh, just talk about who you are.
Yeah. So I'm Joshua Janniere. I live in the great state of Florida, but I am a student at the King's College in New York. I do that online for the time being, and we'll be moving back to New York, where I'm originally from, in the fall. Um, I'm getting a degree in politics, philosophy, and economics with a minor in pre-law and American constitutionalism. So I'm very interested in American constitutional law, or just constitutional law more broadly. Um, and yeah, some of my interests are, like I said, American constitutional law, early modern jurisprudence, which you do. The work that we'll be talking about today is within that genre. Still interested in early modern theology. It was really my interest in early modern theology that shifted me towards, I guess, a mostly neglected field of
Mhm.
Reformed Orthodoxy, and that's Reformed Orthodox jurisprudence. Um, Through the work of Asa Gudrian, Richard Muller, so he has some articles, David Sitzma, we're starting to get a good grasp on Reformed Orthodox philosophy, and then an extension of their metaphysic and their philosophy is their jurisprudence. So, although Franciscus Junius formally wasn't a jurist, he did have a robust legal education, and hence why he can just ad hoc just write a treatise on not a treatise, but on a treatise on the Mosaic polity. So that's what I do. Constitutional law, interested in the reincorporation of natural law into contemporary American jurisprudence. I'll probably mention someone who's a boogeyman in the legal field. His name is Adrian Remuel, Catholic convert who's trying to one, he's trying to heal the general amnesia that has plagued the legal field for the last 50 years. Because I think we forget what the sources of American law is, because a lot of the founders, there's a quote by James Wilson in his lectures in law. He says that the positive law is subject to the natural law. So we see this throughout early Republic case laws, particularly in America, and the natural law tradition was definitely an accessible tradition for our early American jurists. And kind of my project, I'm glad that I have the historical sources to kind of inform what I'll be doing, is trying to retrieve Reformed Orthodox jurisprudence. And obviously, it can't be a one-to-one reception, because the context of Reformed Orthodoxy is much different than the context of our day. However, there's still good principles that jurists and legal historians can learn from, so that we can actually have like a proper reading of the founding period and what are our sources of law. So that's what I do. I'm also a classical school teacher. I teach. I'm an upper school literature, not professor, but teacher. I teach 7th and 8th grade classical literature, and next Monday, I'll be lecturing through The Hobbit. So I'm really excited about that. So, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, sounds exciting. And so, with this recent interest in law, so is this what prompted your interest in the? Because this is a very specific subject. So,
Mm-hmm.
of course, for anyone watching, right, we're going to be talking about Junius's Reformed-Thomist theory of law.
Mm-hmm.
But before getting into what that even means, how did you even get interested in such a particular subject, right?
Yeah, so I had not necessarily brief exposure, but Junius was kind of like always my guy. Um, Last year, Ryan Hurd, I believe, he translated Ryan Hurd and Fred Sanders. They translated some disputations of Junius on the Trinity. And I guess particularly my interest in jurisprudence, and I guess Junius's theory of natural law, was kind of an extension of reading his treatise on true theology. So kind of like not necessarily an area of specialty, but an area that I do enjoy reading in is Reformed Orthodox prolegomena. So, and one of those, the representative prolegomena, as Richard Muller argues, for the period of Reformed Orthodoxy, is of course Junius's treatise on true theology. So, in that book, he has a section on natural theology, which is part of it's part of the genre of ectypal theology, a form of ectypal theology, and obviously an extension of that is natural law. So once I knew that, okay, the legal profession is one that looks exciting, especially one like there's a lot of work to be done. So right now I'm actually working on an article that I've been thinking about writing for a long time, but just haven't had the time to sit down and do it. But there's for me, I think, especially as a Reformed Christian and someone who's exposed to Reformed scholarship, it's very interesting looking at what happened when Richard Muller wrote his, of course, his magnum opus, the Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, and how that has influenced and really changed the direction of Reformed Orthodox scholarship. And because the conditions of Reformed Orthodox scholarship pre-Muller, I mean, you really didn't have any guys. Like, I guess vestiges of the Reformed Orthodox tradition kind of live on in Voss and Machen. However, they did not write they didn't write extended treatises or extended works on the subject. Right? You can read Voss's Reformed Dogmatics and see references to Antoine Willeus, but unless you know who Antoine Willeus is, you're not really prompted to seek out who he was and check out the works that he has. And I think it's very, very similar to the legal field. So, conditions, the conditions of Reformed Orthodox scholarship in the 20th century is that you had ministers and professors. And I think this is preeminently shown in, I hate to bully him, but Cornelius Van Til. You have bad dichotomies, Calvin versus the Calvinists, even though Van Til won't say that explicitly. But this was just the general thing, like Calvin as, Calvin qua normative for the Reformed tradition. And Richard Muller just obliterates that in, the 30 years that he's been writing. And I think that's what Adrian Vermeule is doing now. So he recently published a book. If I can, there it is. If I can find it, it's a really good book, Common Good Constitutionalism, where he basically argues. I mean, he's reincorporating a classical legal taxonomy, which we'll get to later in the video. But he's basically arguing that the role of political authorities is to pursue the common good. And you see that throughout. You see this one in Junius. You see this in Alsted's Encyclopedia, Johannes Althusius. These are just representative guys who wrote on jurisprudence in the early modern period. So there's a close historical analog, because in the legal field today, the dominant form, I'll kind of mention this as like a background, and the dominant form of constitutional interpretation is something called originalism. For the non-lawyers who are watching, originalism basically means that with regards to our constitutional interpretation, we interpret the Constitution according to the original public meaning. Now, although it's giving deference to sources and the collective wisdom of our fathers, originalism in a sense is kind of anachronistic. One, the founders didn't view themselves as originalists. I guess originalism as an idea doesn't sound as bad, but what originalism has led to in the last 40 years of law, because originalism is a relatively recent thing, what it's led to in the last 40 years of law is legal positivism. So a lot of conservatives only mention the natural law as a matter of historical significance, not as a matter of practical significance. And obviously liberals just vehemently deny the use of natural law. But that's not a good thing. I mean, that's not a good thing. And so a lot of our legal practitioners, young attorneys, lawyers, and mostly Supreme Court justices, they're formed by these ill opinions concerning the nature of law, the history of the American founding, etc. So that was kind of what prompted me in writing this for the Davenant Convivium. I was like, hey,
Right.
I'm familiar with Junius, and I'm glad for the work of Todd Rester in translating his treatise on the Mosaic polity. And I was like, this is a good work. And I mean, I was looking through like Academia EDU and like filled papers, and there's really nothing on Junius. So, like, you have videos on YouTube, but you really have nothing really on his treatise on the Mosaic polity. So
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Thankfully, we do have it translated, right?
Yes.
Like, I have it right here.
Yep.
The Mosaic polity. We have, and like you mentioned, I wasn't aware of Ryan Hurd's translations of a few theses or disputations, you said, and but to my knowledge, we only have his treatise on true theology and the Mosaic polity, and of course there are certain theses translated here and there from other people I've seen, but nothing whole. So hopefully, I have heard, however, that Westminster Seminary Press, I believe, is going to be translating some theses. So hopefully that comes out soon.
That'd be great.
But yeah, now getting into who Junius is. So for one, like, who is, because sometimes if you want to be more esoteric, I believe he's sometimes also referred to as Francois John, right? Not just Junius. So who is this Franciscus Junius, and why is he even important?
Yeah, so Franciscus Junius, his dates are 1545 to 1602. He was born in France. His father, Denis, was a lawyer, and his mother was a good housewife. His father was a prominent lawyer in France, and his father studied at prestigious universities like Poitiers, Bourgeois, etc. Bourges, sorry. And Junius kind of took up after his father in his early years. Junius writes in his autobiography. So the structure of Junius's Mosaic polity, the one that was translated with David Noe translated it with RHB. Junius offers his Vita, his autobiography, where he just goes through the various stages of his life right when he gets to the University of Leiden, and I think he gets there in 1582. Yeah, he gets there around in 15. He gets there in the late 1580s, and then he's a professor at the University of Leiden until his death. But his earlier years, he writes that he developed a taste for law. He was just sitting in, I guess I don't really know what the context of. Maybe he was filing briefs with his dad, but he talks about practicing law from home with his dad. He was sent off to university to study law, and while he was sent off to university, his father he's sent off with particular men that his father entrusts for the safety and care of his child, and these men aren't particularly the most pious men. I guess it's very, very interesting reading his vita. I mean, one, as a college student, it made life really relatable, and I'll get to that in a second. But two, it also showed like the precursors to Romanticism, and it was kind of in like the common ethos even in the 16th century. So like the leader of the pack that Junius is sent with, he talks about you will never be a high statesman or successful unless you engage in love. I'm paraphrasing. And therefore Junius, while his time in law school, he's subject to many common temptations, such as lust. And there's a really funny quote in the Mosaic polity. I'll read it. So he refers to these women as she dogs, or canes ilia, it's a pejorative term in the French. He says, they, the she dogs, did not set up upon me one at a time and individually, but rather in groups of 3 or 4 at the same time. With hands joined, they assailed me with the utmost shamelessness. Thus, if my mind were drawn away to their degradation, they might boast in the trophies won for my innocence. At last I became so irked at their effrontery that when one of them, with a crowd of onlookers present, tried to put her hand on me flirtatiously, I landed a heavy blow on her. So it's like, way to mortify the flesh, Junius. He just punched someone. So yeah, he was subject to those common temptations, and actually through discussion with, I guess, an Epicurean philosopher, he's convinced by the words of this Epicurean philosopher, and Junius becomes an atheist for a little bit. So then when he returns to, I think he mentions how they were having dinner at the table, and he just wanted to say what happened when he was at law school, and the state of his soul. Junius goes to his room, and his father leaves the Gospel of John open in his bed, and Junius speaks about his conversion, his return to the faith, and just God's faithfulness. It's very, very interesting, especially when we talk about an autobiography. Obviously, the first Christian autobiography is Augustine's Confessions. And yeah, Junius definitely speaks with an Augustinian accent throughout his vita, definitely drawing inspiration from Augustine. So after Junius comes back to the faith, he is then deciding whether or not he should pursue a law degree. He should, I guess, law degree, or go into pastoral ministry. Junius decides then to go into pastoral ministry, where he studies at Geneva while Calvin was there. So he would have had Calvin as a professor. He would have had Calvin for a professor for a short period of time, because obviously Calvin dies in the 1560s.
Yeah.
But he had Theodore Beza. He mentions how it's so interesting just thinking about it in the context of my college life, how a couple of pals and him, they went off to Zurich. I believe that's where Peter Martyr Vermigli was. They went off to Zurich to see Peter Martyr Vermigli. So it's just like, it's very, very interesting that he just mentions these figures. It's like, yeah, we went to Heidelberg to see Zanchi, and to see Peter Martyr Vermigli. So yeah, Junius graduates from Geneva, and then he's right out of Geneva. Just this is just how things work in the early modern period. He received a call. I believe he pastored in Antwerp first. While he was in Antwerp, there was so that was in Germany. I believe that was in Germany. I could be wrong about that, but he pastored in Antwerp. And the basic context of Antwerp was that there was a large group of people who were anti-French, and obviously Junius is a Frenchman. That makes his life in danger, puts his life in danger. So he leaves Antwerp, and kind of like Junius was just like an exile for just various stints at a time. And I guess the only consistency that he actually gets is once he receives a post at the new founded university in, it's very, very hard to pronounce. Yes, the new university of, so not Peter Martyr Vermigli, Zacharias Ursinus and Zanke, they taught there at Neustadt, and that was started by Johann Casimir, who was the brother of the Duke at the time, well, the king at the time, Frederick III. His brother dies, and then his brother Johann Casimir starts a newly founded Reformed university, which doesn't last for a long time. The dates for that is 1579 to 1583. After that, Junius, after his time at Neustadt, Junius then receives a post at the University of Heidelberg, and that's where that's kind of where we get, I guess, the proto. He starts talking about the relationship between natural theology and supernatural theology. He has various commentaries, so it's like a proto-biblical theology, you can say. And then Junius is only at Heidelberg for a few years because he was exiled out of Heidelberg again because Germany became Lutheran. And once Germany became Lutheran, he had to find a new job. And the University of Leiden in the late 1580s, they happily call Junius. And that's kind of a brief. He dies in 1602, so he's not there. So he's probably he's there for, I guess, about 12 to 13 years. He dies relatively young, but that's where a lot of the famous works of Junius, such as the treatise on the Mosaic polity and the treatise on true theology, were written at the University of Leiden. So,
and Junius is so significant that I think I've heard him or read him referred to as one of, if not the father of Reformed Scholasticism, right? Because he is very early on. And interestingly enough, everyone has their guy. Like you mentioned, Junius is your guy.
Mm-hmm.
People know Matthew, I believe, right? This guy is obviously Vermigli, and people have their guys. I've actually been quite interested in a figure that no one ever really talks about either, right? Antoine de Chandel. And I've read that he also is considered to be one of the fathers of Reformed Scholasticism, along with Junius. And so it seems like these guys are pretty relevant to us, right? Especially with our retrieval of the scholastic method in the confessional Reformed tradition. And so
that's super crucial, especially to talk about, especially since scholasticism is a pejorative term today in our Reformed context. And it's a term that people are starting to accept, but you still have people who speak about scholasticism in a pejorative way. And I think Richard Muller kind of elucidates this problem. So we're actually, a couple of friends and I, we're doing a year in PRD, Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, and we're just having discussions, every other week. But when we look at the Reformation, obviously the Reformation was an ecclesiastical movement. And the only way that this ecclesiastical movement is going to perpetuate is, obviously, you need confessionalization, but you also need pedagogy. It needs to be taught. So scholasticism is kind of like an inevitable thing for Reformed theology, because especially in the period that Junius is right before the beginning of the early period of Orthodoxy. And for those who don't know the threefold division, you have the early period of Orthodoxy, which refers to the period of 1860. That's debated on 1865 to 1620. I tend to lean with Van Alselt's categorization of the periods of orthodoxy. Muller and him kind of differ on that, but it's not a major disagreement. And then you have the period of high orthodoxy, which is 1620 to 1700. And then from 1700, you have the 1700 to 1750, you have the period of late orthodoxy. So in the period of early orthodoxy, so we would call Junius an early Orthodox theologian. And so Junius, he's at the brink of questions about scholasticism. So we see that the nature, so this is why like we can read Calvin, and Calvin speaks in a different tone than Junius. And then we can read Junius and say that there's continuity between Calvin and Junius. So we're against the Calvinist thesis. There's continuity between Calvin and Junius, but they're just different genres. Calvin was a pastor. Junius was a pastor as well, but he was mostly a professor. So this is, I think, Andreas Hypersius is a theologian who's kind of neglected, but he's in the 1560s, and I believe he has a work on the method of scholasticism, something like that, or scholastic theology. We have someone in the 1560s, right at the early period of orthodoxy, we can categorize him as a second generation reformer who's writing in a way different tone than Calvin is, but there's fundamental continuity because the difference is in genre. So the natural flow of the Reformation is from church to school, and obviously scholasticism, school is in it. It's just the method of the school, schoolmen. So I get why a lot of people can read Calvin's pejorative remarks about the schoolmen, but Richard Muller has done stuff on this. I'm pretty sure David Seitzma has done stuff on this. But the schoolmen that Calvin is referring to, and even Martin Luther in his Heidelberg Disputation, are late medieval inventions. Just late medieval, it's just really bad. I don't think, because Calvin even, he refers to the pure scholastics. He might be mentioning Bonaventure, but Calvin is definitely fond of the scholastics. I think all of the periods of Reformed Orthodoxy will universally acknowledge that the scholasticism that Calvin is speaking about is late papal inventions that are heavily nominalistic, etc. But Antoine Chandu and Junius are really, really important people, and I guess the fathers of Reformed scholasticism in a sense.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Muller engages with that, with the schoolmen, also with Calvin's sometimes pejorative remarks on the scholastics, which, and he'll borrow from Armand Louvel's dissertation back from the 60s on Calvin's criticism of scholastic theology, where of course he and Louvel together argue, as well as some other people now argue. Carl Trueman argues the same thing, that of course Calvin is he's thinking of very specific French theologians from Sorbonne, not the scholastics such as Bonaventure, Scotus, Aquinas, etc. So that's not necessarily who he has in mind. But getting into now, I mentioned earlier, right? The conversation here is about Junius and his Thomist theory of law, right? So could you provide us with the way that Thomas defines law, the way that Junius defines law, and any other ways in which, or what do we mean exactly when we say that he has a Thomist theory of law?
So I'll do that, but I want to first kind of for context for the audience, kind of elucidate the general structure of the Mosaic polity. So what was the context to Junius writing that? Because I think it elucidates a lot of the problems, especially like theonomy. I think Junius's treatise on true theology just obliterates theonomy. So the general context of just the early modern period is very, very different from our period today. You had state and nationwide churches. So they had general establishments. So when Junius was at Heidelberg, it was Reformed. Then Junius went to a more amicable place for Reformed theology, which was Leiden, and everyone was Christian. It was just that's just what it was. So that's why kings and princes they can call, just like Constantine did for Nicaea. They did so in 1618 for the Synod of Dort. So the general questions that were plaguing, I guess, the university in a sense, and I guess a lot of the lawyers were, what is the relationship of the Mosaic law to our Christian commonwealth? Which is it's a perfect question. It's like, okay, they were Christian, we are Christian, they had Christian laws. Should we have the same laws? And Junius takes this. So they actually asked him to write this. And Junius takes this opportunity to elucidate that question. So the general structure of the book is theses 1 through 7. So thesis 1 covers the definition of law. Thesis 2 through 7, the various forms of law, and then thesis 8 through 38. He has 38 theses. 8 through 38 establishes the relationship of the Mosaic civil law to, let's say, the civil law of the Netherlands, and basically how the civil law of Israel is abrogated. And we can get into that a bit if we want to just make our theonomist friends mad. But now getting into Junius's definition of law. So, I mean, something that I found, especially being exposed to Thomas, something that I found just really, really interesting is just, he speaks with a Thomistic accent throughout this whole thing. So basically, the first sentence of Junius's treatise on the Mosaic polity is, laws and ordinance of reason to the common good, ordained by either the political authority or, the general definition is those who are in charge of the community, who is in charge of the community. And that's really just an adaptation of Thomas's 90th question in the Prima Secunda Pars. He says laws and ordinance of reason to the common good enacted by those in charge of the community. And he adds this weird thing, and he says, and promulgated. So Junius just completely pulls that out from Thomas. But that definition has an earlier ancestor with Isidore of Seville and his etymologies. Isidore kind of gives the same definition of what law is. And then I also saw the general structure that Junius follows in the Mosaic polity is really, really close to Thomas's structure and Thomas's treatise on law. So just looking at that, just pulling the definition from Thomas, one, we can say with assurance that Junius was familiar with Thomas and self-consciously was drawing from him, because we see this in the definition, and then we see this in his structure of the work. And then two, it shows that, I mean, especially in the context of when we talk about Van Tillenism, natural law jurisprudence, the Reformed Orthodox, I mean, especially with Junius, like, he studied under Theodore Beza. He was at Geneva. It's like, if we're going to say Calvin is normative for the Reformed tradition, I think we should, it's like, was there some sort of discontinuity that happened that we're not familiar with? But he studied at Geneva, and he studied at Calvin's University. So we see that, especially, Van Til will read Calvin's, Duplex Cognito Dei and kind of say, oh, natural revelation that is objectively known to all men via the conscience. No such thing. I mean, they can't abstract propositions from nature and deduct about the nature of God. So it's like, and deduct about God's law. Junius definitely speaks against that. But and also another place where Junius's treatise on law is Thomistic is in his taxonomy of law. So the basic, I guess, with the taxonomy of law basically refers to just the general structure and the various forms of law. I guess for context or some Latin, the basic distinction preceding Junius is that there's distinctions between use and lex. The use can refer to the use naturale, which is the natural law, the use divinum, the divine law, and the use gentium, which is the law of nations. And then obviously lex refers to the positive civil law, which for context in our American context would be the positive law just without jurisprudential positivism. So just because Junius has a section for the civil law, which is called today a positive law, doesn't mean that Junius was a positivist, and we obviously know that because he's acknowledging higher sources of law.
Mm-hmm.
But those are some ways in which Junius's definition of law is Thomistic, his taxonomy of law is Thomistic, and also his understanding of the Mosaic Commonwealth is very, very, very Thomistic. So, yeah.
Right. And interestingly enough, just because to prepare for this interview, I did look a little bit into, I read some of the Mosaic polity, and I've actually kind of gained my own interest in law um, as a result of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I am actually interested in looking at some of the Spanish scholastics on this issue
Mm.
because, for example, I would sometimes find myself seeing Suarez.
Yeah.
He
Good old
will
boy.
sometimes appeal to Thomas. Thomas's definition of law. He'll appeal to Thomas in other aspects of law. And so it's really interesting to see the way that Thomas shapes later theologians on
Mm-hmm.
this particular issue. So getting into, because now typically people, when they think of law, they don't think of law as having any kind of relationship to, say, Aristotle's four causes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yet a relationship exists. So how exactly do Thomas and Junius understand the causes of law?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So this question is kind of you kind of have to place it in context in regards to their taxonomy of law. So it's like obviously you have the divine law, the natural law, the law of nations, and then the positive law. So with regards to the causes of law, so we would only apply an Aristotelian etiology to the natural law, the law of nations, and the positive law. So we would not so kind of the cause of all law, especially the natural law, the natural law, the divine law. I forgot to mention the eternal law. So the cause of the natural law, the divine law, and the positive law in some instances. I'll get to that later. But the causes of those two laws are the divine essence, so the divine reason. So I
Mhm.
write in my paper that for Thomas and Junius, the divine reason in general is only distinct in our manner of conception.
Mhm.
I'll skip down to this. However, the eternal law is treated as the divine wisdom, which is established for human beings endowed with reason. So basically, kind of what Thomas says in his treatise on law is that the natural law is just the divine law, just for creatures. So it's human participation in the divine law. So obviously, I guess you can get questions. It's like is God subject to the divine law? Thomas denies that. His essence is just the standard of all morality and ethics, and therefore, via participation, through analogy, we get to participate in the divine law, in the eternal law, via participation. And then the divine law refers to that law which is infused into our hearts. So it's like that promise you get in Ezekiel. It's very, very interesting how Junius understands the divine law, because usually it's like, oh, you're referring to the Ten Commandments. Like, yes, in a sense he is, but he's specifically talking about how the divine law is infused into rational creatures, and how God, by his grace. So it's the divine law is only that's one distinction between the natural and divine law. That the natural law is available to all men. However, what the divine law does, according to Junius, is that it further enforces the natural law. So for Junius, the divine law, through the infusion of God's grace, because the divine law can only come to people via the context of grace, what the divine law does is further emphasize and further enforce the obligations of the natural law. So we would say that that the divine law and the natural law do not differ in substance, but only via the means of communication. And Junius explicitly says that. So the causes of those law, and then the jus gentium. It's very interesting how the jus gentium is used. So for people who don't know, it refers to the law of nations. You see this in Cicero. You see this in just every early modern jurist. You see this in Suarez. You see this. It's pretty expansive. Bartolo Sessusverato, who's a commentator on the jus commune tradition, which is the Roman synthesis of Roman law and canon law, refers to the law of nations. and you see this in Thomas as well. The law of nation just refers to the collective wisdom of all the nations, and just things that are just ipso facto true, such as it's wrong to kill. Like that is a law of nation. Law is one of the laws of nation. It's wrong to steal. Perjury is wrong, etc. So it just refers to the collective wisdom. So that, I guess, in a sense, the Ucientium is used interchangeably, like you see this in Thomas, and you also see this in Junius to a degree. The Ucientium is used interchangeably with the natural law, because essentially that's what it is. It's just the agreement of the nations concerning their observations of the natural law. And this is further, especially that concept of the Ucientium, it comes from the Greek philosophical concept of the consensus entium, which, for those who are familiar, if you read the structure, let's say Francis Turretin's doctrine of God and Thomas's doctrine of God, one of the arguments for the existence of God is the consent of the nations, that God exists and that religion is a good and a natural thing. So that's just an extension, just in a different fields. So
Right. And related to the causes, you also write that Junius and Thomas debunk the modern separation of law from the end of human life.
yes.
So, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, and that goes back to just our American context. Like I don't. People did not think about law that way until relatively recently. So basically, with just the big influence of American law in the 20th century, just law in general. You have guys like Jeremy Bentham, who was an English positivist, legal positivist, 18th century English legal positivist. And then you have guys like H.L.A. Hart in the American context, who was a leading legal philosopher at the University of Oxford. So most of American law and most law in general, but it's like the phenomenon in America is very, very interesting. I don't know why law is like this, but most of it is just plainly positivist. Like law only refers to written statutes. There's no such thing as a natural law, and just that's it. So just the influence of positivism on our contemporary American and political context have therefore in turn has just changed our perspective of what law is. If law only refers to written statutes and you quote unquote can't legislate morality, then law has no teleology. So that's one of my criticisms, particularly with originalism, is that originalism in all its multifaceted form, because it's a family of theories of interpretation. Originalism in its normative claims will always lead to a bad legal ontology. So what I mean by that is that originalism will lead to a bad understanding of the nature of law. However, when your opinions are informed by the classical tradition and you have a classical legal taxonomy, you don't, an objection that's often thrown at people who think this way is that you just get rid of the text. So the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the subsequent amendments that were ratified, they mean nothing to you because you only care about natural law. No, what we say is that the positive law should be an expression, to quote Junius, of the natural and divine law. And obviously that's applied with prudence. I mean, just a basic Aristotelian political philosophy is that the political the political authority must excel in the virtue of prudence, in the quality of prudence. So that's what I refer to. I mean, just Junius's definition that law is an ordinance of reason. So laws are ordinance of reason. So he's referring to the canons of reason, right? Things that all men know. So that's why I can tell you murder's wrong and we can just agree about it. Law is an ordinance of reason to the common good. So we have that "to" there, and it's to the common good. The general teleology of law is to promote the common good. And I guess in our American context, we see this in the preamble of our Constitution, is to promote the general welfare. It's just a different way, a different variant of that common good definition. And this just shows you that the founders were definitely aware with the classical tradition that precede them. So because of those modern understandings, it's like law is not. It's like the basic, the function of law. I'm going, what is it? There's a quote from why am I forgetting this quote? It's Ulpian. I can find it right now, but Johannes Alsted uses that quote in his. There we go. Found it. So just a basic definition of the common good is. Yes, the precepts. I don't know. The precepts of legal justice are to live honestly, to do no man no harm, and then to give each man his due. So that's the basic. Those are the precepts of legal justice.
Right.
And you see that Johannes Alsted in his encyclopedia, he uses that same definition from Ulpian, which is from the Digest of Justinian. And you see that in Thomas as well. The basic precepts of law is to live honestly, to do no man no harm, and to give each man his due. And not a lot of people believe that about law anymore, due to the influence of legal positivism. But those are my worries. But yeah.
Yeah, and like touching on the taxonomy of law, you also talk a little bit about the syntheresis. Now, for those who don't already know, what does that even mean? And then after that, how do Thomas and Junius understand the syntheresis?
Okay. Yeah, so it's a very obviously obscure term, but the general definition of the syntheresis is the location. It's a place in the rational faculty where the infusion of the natural law takes place. So I make a distinction in the paper between the syntheresis and the natural law. So they're two different things. The syntheresis just refers to, and you see this in William Ames, you see this obviously in Thomas, and then you also see this in Junius as well. The syntheresis just refers to that place in the rational faculty where, one, the natural law is infused, and then two, the natural law is preserved. So a lot of Barthian readings, obviously you have the famous debate between Barth and I believe it was Emil Brunner, correct? I believe so. And Brunner is like, natural law, natural theology, and you have that famous 9 by Karl Barth. And then, I mean, there's a book, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but reincorporating natural law into Reformed theological ethics. He basically argues, just to be candid, that Van Til, in a sense, was kind of Barthian. It's like, a lot of people's objections to natural theology are simply on the grounds of the nature of the intellect for post-lapsarian man. But that's not a problem. And it's especially not a problem because you see Paul referring to those principles of justice, to those things which are known to all men. I mean, they who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires. And obviously he's using nature in a different sense. He's using it to refer to ethnicity, the Jews, the Gentiles who do not have the 10 Commandments by nature do what the law requires. So you see that's the basic structure. I mean, especially that argument that Paul lays out in Romans 2, it's contingent for his whole argument throughout the book. So just the Barthian readings of Reformed Orthodoxy and saying that because of the nature of the intellect for post-lapsarian man is damaged, we therefore no longer can refer to any sort of natural theology or natural law. But this is something that Junius deals with. He has a fourfold. He's deriving this from obviously Augustine's fourfold division of the state of man, but he also has a division, the distinctions between the fourfold estate of the natural law in man. So the natural law in the state of integrity, in the state of sin and misery, in the state of grace, and then obviously the beatific state.
Right.
But something that's key is that the natural law still exists. And that's the purpose of the positive law, which we can get to later. But anyways,
yeah, and so something that Junius touches on in the Mosaic polity is the mutability and the immutability of the Mosaic code. And so when he talks about this, when he discusses it, in what way or ways does he rely on Thomas, and in what way, to some people, maybe some people's surprise, why does he invoke classical Roman jurists such as Justinian?
Hmm. So yeah, that's a section of my paper on the use Gentium and the use civile
Hmm.
in Junius and Thomas. So the basic, like, if you read any classical treatise, like if you read the digest of Justinian, or the Institutes of Ulpian, and the basic structure, the way that they talk about the positive civil law, there's a part of the civil law that is temporal or mutable, and then there's a part of the civil law that is immutable. The presupposition behind that is definitely much different than our American context, because most of our civil, well, I'll use a practical example. For example, I guess a form of positive civil law in the American context for like your everyday person is speed limit.
Hmm.
That's a mutable thing, right? Because
Yep.
in Germany, they want to go 100 miles per hour. I don't know if they do that, but just say hypothetically they do. In America, we want to go 50, right? That's a mutable part. But however, the fact that they have a speed limit, right? There's something immutable behind the presupposition of that positive law, and that
Right.
is that life matters and we should protect it. So that's basically Junius's argument, that with the Mosaic civil law, and that is very, very important that Junius categorizes the Mosaic law as civil law and not divine, because the divine law and the eternal law and the natural law are always binding. However, the civil law, hence the word civil, is different for local jurisdictions. So the laws of Florida, although some of them are universal, such as you can't murder, that doesn't really differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, there's particular laws that we have here in Florida that we don't have in DC. And
Right.
this is a basic understanding of the civil law, that the civil law is the law of the city. And that the law of the city is going to look much different in Athens than it does in, let's say, England, right? However, the presupposition behind the immutable part of the civil law is that the civil law should be an expression of the natural law. So basically, what Junius does is Junius reincorporates Thomas's doctrine of determination. So determination, and the way that it can be applied in our American context is, it's debated upon, but the way that Adrian Vermeule understands it, I think it's really, really perfect, because one, it avoids judicial supremacy, because according to our Constitution, our form of government is obviously a mixed form of government, which according to Thomas is the best form of government, although maybe it's not practiced the way that it should be. However, it is not the role of the judiciary to make policies. That's the role of the judiciary is not to make laws. The role of the judiciary is to interpret laws. So the way that we can avoid judicial supremacy, especially in the American context, is with Thomas's doctrine of determination, and Junius reincorporates that as well. But basically, let's say the role of judges is to interpret the principles of use, to interpret the principles of the natural law. It's only interpreting, so that concurs with our Constitution. However, it's the role of, let's say, the Senate and Congress in our American context to apply that law. So that's Thomas's. So the twofold juridical process for Thomas and Junius is that you have deducing the principles of law, so interpreting those principles of law, and then making those things concrete in a particular jurisdiction. That is the role of political authorities. And the thing is, the civil law, although it's contingent on the natural and divine law, it's also contingent on the circumstances and conditions of a particular polity. So there's this Sir John Fortescue, who's a great commentator on the English legal tradition. He's a medievalist. He has a book called In Praise of the Laws of England, which is basically sort of a dialogue. So the prince asks Sir John, why, the laws of England are great. Why aren't the laws of England applied everywhere? It's like, and then he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, it's because they're English, right?
Right.
So it's like, I mean, especially England, particularly in that time, was avoiding the despotism and just the desire for conquest that, other people like France, weren't really willing to do. And I think that's how we avoid, especially when we think about like what are the errors of Marxism. The errors of Marxism, besides like all the ideological stuff, but jurisprudentially speaking, the errors of Marxism is saying that there's one universal civil law that should be applied everywhere, no matter of context. Like that's not how law works. Like law has context, and
Right.
law, Montesquieu says this, law should be suited for the particular people. And the way that it can be suited for the particular people is that we're keeping in mind their conditions and the circumstances, but also that doesn't mean that we do law without the natural law and the divine law. We refer to the natural law and the divine law because the civil law should be the concrete form that's suited for context of the natural law. So basically, the civil law should be the natural law concretized, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's the general structure of how Junius parses out. And I guess to talk about in relation to theonomy, the reason why theonomy doesn't make sense is because one, it avoids the classical taxonomy of law. And then two, what it fails to recognize is that the civil laws of Israel, so it's within that genre, the civil laws of Israel were contingent on their circumstances and conditions and were suited for their particular jurisdiction. Like you don't see God imposing the civil law on the Canaanites, although
Right.
although the Israelites are called to conquer. But you don't see, it's like, God wasn't enforcing the civil law on the British Isles, right? So it's like, because the Mosaic civil law was suited for particular people, and since that particular people, as the Westminster Confession, in sundry times he gave them manifest laws, etc. But when
Mm-hmm.
those laws are now expired because we're not Israelites, we can have our own form of civil law, and Junius makes this clear. And although he says that the Mosaic law is probably the greatest form of civil law because its author is God. However, that does not abrogate the nature of what civil laws are. Just because God is the author of them, author of the civil laws of Israel, does not necessitate that they are ipso facto divine law. But anyways.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Especially touching on theonomy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's related to the subject. And usually, from my experience, theonomy is something very specific. Oftentimes, people try to present theonomy in a very broad way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where theonomy just means that you like God's law,
Yeah.
right? And those who are against theonomy don't like God's law. That's us, right?
Yeah.
But no, it's something very, very specific, especially with relation to the Mosaic
Mm-hmm.
law. But that's good. I don't really have any more super specific questions, but is there
Mm-hmm.
anything else that you find significant to say about the subject before concluding thoughts?
No, yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, I think I would encourage everyone to pick up the work. Um, it's something that, I mean, especially because I think what happens today, I'm familiar with some Reformed lawyers like Timon Klein, and he's doing great stuff. He has, it's very, very good to see, like he has articles with an article with the Harvard Law Journal on common good constitutionalism and originalism, and he's making reference to the syntheresis. It's like, especially if you're a Reformed lawyer, I think the temptation to bend the knee to the legal status quo is definitely, I understand it, but I think, and I don't mean that to say, so I guess for context, I don't mean that originalism, the way that it's practiced, should be just completely discarded and we should just forget about it. No, it's like, I'm more comfortable with a, common good originalism, because there's good virtues about originalism, like it respects the authority of legal texts, precedent, blah blah blah. However, what I am opposed to is a bad understanding of what law is. I mean, as a Christian, especially thinking about Romans 13 and just the various treatises that the Christian tradition has offered on law, I don't want to say that those treatises have nothing to bear in hopefully a potential profession of mine. And yeah, I think it's very, very important that, and especially when you start to read the founders, guys like James Wilson. If you read his lectures on law, I don't think you'll come out a fully orbed originalist. You'd be more open to the natural law, and you see that this is just the general milieu of the American founding. I mean, especially William Blackstone, who's behind me. His commentaries on law, his commentaries on the laws of England. He references the natural law, the civil law, and also the law of nations. So you see that the classical tradition has definitely does have a bearing, and obviously Junius is part of that classical tradition. I would definitely like, especially Catholics, because Catholics are very weird. But a lot of the representatives, unfortunately, it's like a lot of Protestants are really, really behind in the whole retrieval thing. And yeah, it's like, if you're Reformed, like, just know that your tradition has a lot to offer. And Junius has a lot to offer, just not in the subject of law, on Trinitarian theology. I was talking with a friend yesterday, and it was like, just think about, relatively recent works by Reformed authors on Trinitarian theology. It's like, I don't own any of them because none of them are really good. Like, I'm just deferring to a lot of the Catholics. And that's not, and that obviously that can, make someone obsessed with the Catholic tradition and therefore leading to a conversion to Roman Catholicism, we don't want. But I think part of my motives in writing this paper is, one, to display that the Reformed tradition is classical, that the Reformed tradition is in step with the medieval tradition to the degrees that the medievals didn't err. And yeah, I think read Junius. He's really cool. Had a very interesting life. I was going to mention this when I was giving some context about Junius, but he talks about his college experience being impoverished. And if you're in college, every college student knows that the college experience is very, very, you're just broke. You have no money. You
Fortunately.
can't. But yeah, Junius is great. And I mean, I'm very excited what you're doing here in the channel. It's like, we need more young confessional and, scholastic Protestants to, one, hold positions in academia, for the sake of the church, and then also, two, it's like, hold positions in public office for the sake of the temporal common good of our polity. But yeah, Junius is really, really good. He's super based. As the kiddos say. But yeah.
And so, and that really touches on what I was going to ask about, because generally there's like the general question of why people should even care about law, for one, since many people don't really think about it, especially at our age. But then the more specific question of why should anyone care about Junius having similarities with Thomas on law? And yeah, I also think that it's quite significant because it's always good to have conversations, not just where they agree and where you see similarities, but conversations over any kind of relationship between prominent Reformed figures and Thomas, especially in our day because of all the controversy over the appropriation of Aquinas as a figure that we can use in our tradition. And this is just one of many examples where we see the Reformed Orthodox positively appropriate him.
Yeah.
Right? There are countless examples, and this is just another one of them that people should take note of. People should know that they do use Aquinas where they find him to be good. Of course, they're eclectic. They use others as well, but still, none of them, in their mind, none of them are still better than Aquinas, the greatest of the scholastics, as Zonke will say,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I guess to make our Ventilians more happy, there's there is continuity and discontinuity, and this is a minor part. I guess it's adiaphora, but Junius does differ on Thomas on one thing in this book, and that is whether the peniology of the Mosaic law is normative for their Christian commonwealth back then. So Thomas would say that, because Thomas has a question on like whether heretics should be punished, and the basic medieval answer is that heretics should be punished. Obviously, that differs. I mean, I'm not in favor of beheading people, but you do have blasphemy laws in early America. So it's like we can acknowledge that the existence of blasphemy laws. I don't shun them. I don't look at them with embarrassment. I think they're a good thing, because I mean, behind the presupposition of blasphemy laws is that true religion should be preserved, and religion is one of the, as Washington said in his farewell address, an indispensable religion and morality are two indispensable sources of politics. However, Junius does differ from Thomas, because he says that the penalties of the Mosaic law are not normative. Thomas says that they are normative, but yeah, you see that continuity, and also similar form of discontinuity, but it's discontinuity where you can. It's like a lot of Vantilians will say that the discontinuity that you see between the Reformed and the medievals is stuff like natural theology, stuff like natural law. It's like, no, I mean, this is just a Christian understanding of law. So
yeah, that's true. I actually wasn't aware that they differed in that, but yeah, it is good to know, because this is also something that Donnelly notes, right? Like whenever J.P. Donnelly talks about, because he talks about Zonky too, but more people are familiar with his paper on Ramili and Aquinas, and he does note that even Ramili, one of the more Thomistic figures in our tradition, still cannot be called a Thomist, right? We're not necessarily calling ourselves Thomists in all respects. It's just that we have a positive reception of Thomas, the individual, as a theologian, right? Not just as a philosopher. You see that, of course, in a positive reception even of his biblical commentaries, which people are often surprised to know about. But yeah, it's good to note that there are sometimes differences. Like, there's a difference here between Junius and Thomas on law. But still, overall, there's an appropriation of them, right? So,
Yeah.
other than that,
Yeah.
unless there's any other thoughts.
No, I think that's all. Yeah, this was definitely a good combo. I definitely do appreciate you bringing me on, and yeah, I would love. There's like, yeah, it's like I'm trying to. I had like an idea, because I saw that you posted about maybe doing something on Ramism, but I wanted to see because I've read some stuff on Ramus, and I have a friend of mine who he works at Columbia University in New York, so he's like able to lend some books to me. He just printed out this huge stack of a paper on Petrus Ramus, but I want to see if there's any influence of the Ramus method. Obviously, you see it in Alstead. You see it in Petrus Van Maastricht. You see it amongst a lot of the English theologians like William Ames, William Perkins, obviously, and his table of predestination. But I wanted to check early modern Reformed and maybe Catholic and Lutheran treatises on law, and whether or not there was any reception of Petrus Ramus and his didactic method. And I appreciate being on the channel. It's very, very nice. Got a nice setup here, and like the thing in the corner. Yeah.
I am interested in doing that at some point, because I have been reading on Ramus, specifically in Ramus and Ramism in William Perkins. As you said, you also see it in William Ames and others. And of course, I'm interested in the way that Antoine de Chandoux engages with it as well, since it's a bit of a complicated question, his relationship to Ramism. and then the scholastic method. But it's something that I'll get to in the future. Um, but yeah, other than that, you have your own thing, right, with the Irenic
Yeah.
Protestants, right? It's Matthew, Jordan,
Yep.
and Jonathan, I
Yep.
believe. Right. So most people who see this probably know of it, but I think I know a few who might not.
Okay.
So uh, they should definitely check that out because, similar content, of
Mhm.
course, looking into the Reformed Orthodox and really getting into the details of our tradition, right? Because that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, I love the podcast. Love the guys. We all just have our shticks.
Mhm.
Jordan is interested in Scottish Presbyterianism. Matthew, of course, is interested in Vermilion. Jonathan is interested in the Book of Common Prayer, and then I guess my interests is just eclectic bunch. You have early modern theology, early modern jurisprudence, American law. Um, but yeah, it's really really fun. I appreciate you making our thumbnails because we're not as aesthetically inclined as your channel is.
Mm,
um, but yeah, it's like you can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube. Um, I'm really excited for this season. Our season is called "The Halls in the Room."
mhm,
The rooms, basically, just going through the various streams of the Protestant tradition. So we're going to touch on Anglicanism, on Lutheranism, on the Baptists. Uh,
mm.
I hate to say that. Just kidding. Um, Presbyterians, and then we're going to have something on the Continental Reform. So, and we're going to have various guests for that. So I'm really really excited for that, and yeah, love what we're doing over there. Love DAVNet. We're a DAVNet sponsored podcast. DAVNet's doing great stuff. I guess we can do a little promo for there. So I have this one. Uh,
Right.
I can tell you that I'm still struggling financially because of this purchase. Um, but DAVNet is coming out with a hardback copy. I think in a couple months. So hardback
Should be
copy.
March, I heard.
Okay, so yeah, March. So next month. Next month, the Light and Synopsis will be out for those who do not want to go broke with buying Brill books because
Yeah.
they literally cost an arm and a leg.
Yeah, they are expensive. But yeah, I'm also looking forward to the series on Protestantism, on the halls and the rooms. That's definitely an interesting concept because, of course, you're drawing from C.S. Lewis, right,
Mm-hmm.
with the entire
Yep.
concept. So, yeah, that's something to look out for as well. Um, Maybe I don't know if I would particularly join that series, but
Mm-hmm.
it would be nice to join at some point to talk about, as I mentioned, Antoine de Chandeau, someone who is never brought up in our conversations,
Yeah,
a very fascinating figure.
yeah,
So,
I definitely want to get around to reading that book published with Oxford University Press.
mhm.
There's a couple of those that I really want to get on. I haven't read Michael Lynch's book on John Davenant. Um, uh,
Ooh,
yeah, hypothetical universalism. You know, I guess I have an opinion about it, but I mean, I don't particularly feel, I don't know. I don't particularly feel strongly about it.
Mm,
Um, and then I have that one on my iPad somewhere, but yeah, I'll read it in. Yeah.
I have my flirtations with it
Okay.
still. Um,
Flirtations with hypothetical universalism.
it's compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see how because it connects with other doctrines, right?
Hmm.
So you have to kind of work through all of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, me and some other friends are flirting with it. Um,
Yeah.
but don't worry, no need
Yeah.
to worry.
Hopefully, I never flirt with it.
Well, actually, uh, to close off, I've heard that you have had a recent interest in Anglicanism.
Yeah.
Is that true? How is your certain, let's say, denominational affiliation going?
Hmm. Well, I guess it's going well. So I'm still a faithful member in the URC.
Hmm.
I guess my interest in Anglicanism was one via Richard Hooker. Um, I'm still working out the working through the arguments. Still a faithful member in the URC. I don't think that will change until maybe I go to law school, because I'm thinking about going to Notre Dame. And Stephen Wedgeworth's church is out there, Christ Church South Bend, which is a classical and confessional Anglican parish, which holds to the Articles. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the guys like William Blackstone behind me, and Sir Edward Coke, who was Chief Justice of the English Court in the early modern period. All of these guys were Anglican, and James Wilson was Anglican. Who else? Chief Justice John Marshall, who's they refer to him as the Chief Justice in our American context. But yeah, it's very interesting looking at the influence of Anglicanism on American public life, especially at the founding period. I mean, you think about Jamestown, Virginia. I mean, they went in the name of the Church of England and in the name of the Anglican religion. So, love the 1662. I use it daily for devotional. It really, I mean, just praying it consistently has really formed my my theological assumptions. And the thing that I love about the 1662 is just that it's a confessional and really Protestant, version of the prayer book that is, I guess, void of all the ambiguities that you see in, let's say, the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. And it's like, it doesn't have like the weird stuff from the 1979. But yeah, that's my interest in Anglicanism. It's very, very interesting just looking at a lot of like my favorite guys who were Anglican, and just the role that, like I mentioned James Wilson several times in the video. James Wilson in his lectures on law basically borrows Richard Hooker's taxonomy of law. Justin Dyer, I believe that's his name. He has a really good article that you can find online on James Wilson in his lectures on law, and how he's really just copying, pasting from Richard Hooker. But yeah, the Anglican tradition is an interesting one, and also it's one that, like, I guess for me, since I'm not Presbyterian, like denominationally, I'm Dutch Reformed, but the Dutch definitely are more amicable with the English than, let's say, the Scott Presbyterians are.
Yep.
So I'm a royalist at heart. It's interesting that we just celebrated, I think it's like 500 and something years since Charles I was beheaded, January 30th, 31st, I believe. Royalist at heart. I vow to thee, my country, love England. God save the King, His Majesty, King Charles.
Speaking of royalists, I am reading up on Daniel Featley, and actually trying to get Greg Salazar to come on and talk about Featley. Also, another figure who, even those, because there are certain figures that people talk about, right, who have become less obscure, like Turretin and Vermilly. Even Zonky and Votius have become a little less obscure. But you still have other figures who are still a little more obscure, like Polanis, like Antoine, like who else? Bernardinus de Moor.
Bernardinus de Moor, Pierre du Moulin.
Pierre du Moulin.
There's Pierre du Moulin was actually Anglican, him and his dad. Yeah, nice. I guess the last name is deceptive because you would think French, but yeah, there's a French minister in the Church of England. But yeah, that'd be really nice, man. Let me know if that happens, because I definitely want to sit in maybe and tune in. But yeah, the Anglican tradition is an interesting one. Obviously, it's very diverse now, which is unfortunate. But the English tradition has a lot to offer, and
like hypothetical universalism, right?
I guess so. Maybe that's one of the bad things that they have to do. But no, I'm kidding. As I said, I don't feel strongly about the issue, but I do believe. I know that like the podcast buddies of mine, they're gonna watch this, and then Jordan's gonna be like, "So you don't feel strongly about the issue of hypothetical universalism?" It's like, I believe in definite atonement, limited atonement. So we're good. We're good. So, like, I really haven't read on the issue. Like, I've read on the issue of the atonement, but I haven't really, like I said, I haven't read Lynch's stuff. Lynch is an interesting figure. He's a very, very nice guy. He has a lot of good stuff. Like, I remember I was watching a couple of years ago. He has something on Antoine Waleus and his disputation on baptism that he did with the Junius Institute for I think I'm forgetting digital research, something like that. But
Yeah.
very interesting guy. I recommend that book as well, even though I haven't read it. But I hear that, as you said, it's compelling. So
I've
the
read
only
it
thing I'll be
twice. Oh, we'll see. I didn't think so as well. I've read it
yeah,
twice, and yeah, I have my doubts now about the stricter contra-remonstrant Arminian view. But we'll
okay,
see.
yeah,
Um,
we'll see.
Other than that, uh, best of luck on your journey. Even though I will say, I joked with some others when I heard about it, uh, that in some way it feels like it kind of, if you do become Anglican, it kind of defeats the Irenic Protestants'
That is
purpose, right?
true.
It's supposed to be, you have a Dutch Reformed guy and a
Yeah,
Reformed Baptist and an Anglican and a
that is
Presbyterian,
true.
but now you're going to have two Presbyterians and two Anglicans.
Yeah,
So
I mean
they're kind of,
that especially if they were Scott Presbyterians, that'd be a really ironic podcast. But Presbyterianism now as it exists is very much different from the way that it existed back then, and I guess it should exist. But that's very interesting that you mentioned that. It's like, I guess, we joked about that before, because Jordan is no longer Reformed Baptist; he's
yeah.
Presbyterian. Jonathan has made his allegiance to the Church of England. I'm still faithful member of the URC and not leaving until I can't find the church otherwhere, but somewhere else. But I am interested in the Anglican tradition. And then Matthew's just your good old Presbyterian. So we're much more ironic than
Like
how
me.
we began. And I'm glad that Jordan's not a Reformed Baptist anymore, because Baptists are weird.
Oh, yeah.
But
I'd rather y'all have like a Lutheran on than a Reformed Baptist.
yeah, I'd prefer that as well. That was actually we were going to talk about that a couple almost a year ago. That was in the books, but it never happened.
I don't
Lutherans
know
probably.
many. You
I don't
have
know
like,
any either.
I know of the Scholastic Lutherans.
Hmm.
I believe there's two or three
Yeah,
that participate. Um, those guys are good, but I'm sure they're busy a lot themselves.
yeah,
So, but other than that, that should be about it. Um, Once again, thanks for actually taking the time to come on.
yeah. Thank you.
I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested. Some people I know, uh, when I sort of gave them a preview, what the
Hmm.
subject would be about, have been actually anticipating the interview.
Awesome.
So people are interested in it, and it's good to get the information out there, right?
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, that's about it. I'll do another video soon. I won't say what it's about, but it's going to be good. Okay.
Look forward
Okay.
to it, man.
But yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, and we'll talk later.
Alrighty.